Welcome, everyone. Today, we are talking about the 12 steps that are for everybody. I think often we think of the 12 steps as only for people with addiction, and yet we don't realize that many of us are needing those for whatever we are going through, whatever we are turning to maybe numb change or numb pain or whatever we're walking through that's creating some unhealthy patterns in our lives. And today we are so excited to have Ian Morgan Cron, who is a best-selling author, a psychotherapist, an Enneagram teacher, which is probably where you know him from, The Road Back to You, such a popular book. He's an Episcopal priest and the host of the popular podcast Typology, which has over 20 million downloads. And he is talking today about his journey through addiction and his entrance into the 12 steps and what that has done in his life and how it has dramatically shifted his story and how it can shift our story too. His books include the Enneagram Primer, The Road Back to You, which I mentioned, an Enneagram Journey to Self-Discovery, which has sold over 1 million copies. He also has a novel, which someone just brought up to me last night, which is Chasing Francis, about St. Francis. And actually, the person staying with us said it was a very pivotal book in his life, Ian. So there you go. And he also has his new book, The Fix, How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. Ian and his wife live in Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Ian. We are so glad that you're joining us for this conversation today.
Well, thanks, you too. I'm really glad to be here.
So, Ian, just dive into your story. Let's start there.
So I grew up in a pretty troubled home. I had alcoholic and drug addicted dad who died without ever seeing a day of sobriety at 60. It was, as you can imagine, a pretty chaotic, unpredictable house where we were taught in not explicitly but implicitly that when you felt pain inside, it made sense to look to outside solutions to inside problems, right? I won't go into all the details because it just takes too much time. But by the time I was in college, I was already in early stages of my own addiction to alcohol. I got sober for the first time in 1987. And through the 12 steps and a program of recovery for people with drinking problems, right? And I'd like to say that first go round, I kind of just audited the class. You know what I mean? Like looking back,
Yeah.
I really wasn't taking it for credit yet. I hadn't signed up for credit. But it did expel my desire, my craving for drinking. And then I went on with my life for 20 plus years and was very fruitful and productive and did lots of stuff. Then in 2020, right as COVID hit, I went to treatment for a relapse. It was a humiliating, embarrassing, time in my life. Not one that I'm not one of these guys who's going to go on Instagram with that kind of information. You know what I mean? Like some people do it. I'm always like, really? Like you're going to just come out of the box with that stuff? I mean, also because not only did I think it wasn't emotionally wise or spiritually wise to do that, I just also felt like I need to work on myself and my family and friends. That's enough to know. But I did reach a point where I'm like, the 12 steps have had such a profound impact on my faith and on my life for the better. And the fact of the matter is, they're not just for alcoholics and drug addicts. They're for everybody. And guess what? Everybody is somewhere on the addiction continuum and needs a program of recovery. And the steps offer liberation and joy and freedom for those people.
Yeah. Thank you for being vulnerable to tell that embarrassing part of your story that as a grown-up,
You know,
I'm struggling and
yeah.
I'm dealing with this.
As a friend of mine likes to say to me when I was anxious about when so funny, I wrote the book, I had such a good time writing it. It was so much fun. It was a blast. I was in Mexico for 9 months writing away, blah, I was having a great time. And then about 6 months ago, I went, "Wait a minute, people are gonna read this.
Mm.
Oh my gosh, people are gonna read this thing."
Yeah.
And so I went through a season of real anxiety, and this dear friend of mine who you ought to have on the show sometime, his name is Michael Cusick. Michael said, "Ian, just remember, your mess is the message."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, that's really true in life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our messes are the really interesting message that we have for
Mm-hmm.
the world." So here it is, my mess.
And truly are the common story that we often hide. And I think that is what I find so compelling about your story and about this book is that I like what you said about addiction. We're all on the continuum. So can you talk a little bit more about that? What do you mean when you say that?
Great question. So let's just define addiction. An addiction is a compulsive, unhealthy relationship with a person, a substance, or a behavior that has mood altering effects and negative consequences.
Mm.
Okay. Now, that's very clear when we're talking about alcohol and drugs, right?
Mhm.
But the fact of the matter is that could apply to your addiction to technology,
Mhm.
to social media, to food, to workaholism, to unhealthy relationships like codependency is a
Mhm.
full-blown addiction. People pleasing, shopping, spending, exercise, dieting, worry, and I could go on, porn, emotions, all the stuff, right? And so people pleasing, there's another big addiction. Um, these all are behaviors that have mood altering effects and negative consequences, and you can't stop them on your own unaided willpower. And you have
Mhm.
tried and failed repeatedly. And that means a program of recovery like the 12 steps would would really solve the problem for you. So everybody, I don't care, you have to go against thousands of years of not only biblical teaching, but of teaching from the early church fathers and mothers who spoke about attachments at length. They wouldn't have called them addictions, they would have called them attachments. That say everybody, right?
Mhm.
Everybody is looking for an external solution to an internal problem that leaves God out of the equation, right?
Mm.
It's like, "Oh, I have a self-prescribed treatment plan. It's called food, or it's called sugar, or it's called whatever, or prescription drugs or drinking. Doesn't matter." Granted, you could be mild, you could be moderate, or you could be severe on the continuum. The fact remains that regardless of where you are, it has negative spiritual consequences for you. And the
Mhm.
steps are a way out.
Yeah.
This feels so profound to me because I just don't think we recognize it in those terms. And yet when you see it, it's like scales fall off and it's like you get a little pit in your stomach and you're like, "Oh wow, that's me. That's me. I
Mhm.
didn't know that that could be in that category." I didn't, for example, you saying things like people pleasing. And
Mhm.
I mean, we think of the big hitters. We don't think of the ones like workaholism. Oh, I'm on my
Oh,
computer or device all the time.
yes. Workaholism is not a small one.
Mhm.
Like, I can just tell you. So, how many men have I worked with, particularly men, but women fall in this category as well, obviously, who um, worked 80-hour weeks their whole lives. They did it. Their denial was, "I'm doing it for the wife and family," air
Right.
quotes, right? That was the rationalization. They lost their health. They lost their identity to their jobs. They often lost their marriages to wives who felt ignored and neglected. They lost relationships with their children who felt estranged, and even that their dad was a stranger to them because he was never around. And they had heart attacks. So how is that any better? I mean,
Mhm.
that's just, we call that a socially acceptable addiction,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
In fact, what makes that particular addiction so insidious is that we actually admire and applaud workaholics.
It's so
And
true.
and that's what makes that particular addiction really tricky to get over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a lot of things that we might recognize that they're mood altering. Like, yeah, it feels good when I do this, or I really like doing this, like exercise, for example. That's good for me. But it's the combination with the negative consequences
Yeah.
that I'm
Yeah.
thinking through right now, that probably for many of us, we have to have that moment of true evaluation and saying,
Yeah.
what's the trade-off here?
Yep.
And that's probably why the first step is about acknowledging the problem, right?
Yeah.
Because that is the beginning of the journey.
Yeah. So one of the signs that you have an addiction is an obsession. So, for example, I do know lots of men and women both who have an obsession with exercise. Like they just actually can't not do it. Oftentimes it's for reasons of weight control or, you know, and other things that go into it. And now, granted, I'm all in favor of exercise. I see a trainer 5 days a week. I love to exercise. I do not obsess about it. That is not one of my addictions, right? Like, but for some people, it's like they got to get that dopamine hit or they're just not going to function well in the world. Now, I don't mind. Obviously, that's a tricky one because we want everybody to exercise. At the same time, we have to know when have we crossed a line into an unhealthy compulsive relationship with some pattern of behavior that is trying to solve an internal problem through external means, namely the exercise, and without and without God's involvement. We're trying to solve a problem without God's involvement through some other means, and that's called an idol.
Yeah. Right.
All right. And so again, people will sometimes, come back at me and they'll be like, well, I don't really relate to this topic. And I'm like, okay, well, do a little inner soul searching and read the book and do a little inner soul searching. You might be surprised that there's no such thing as those people. There's only us. There's no them. This idea that there's those people. Sometimes I think people like to say that in a kind of semi-superior judgmental way. And but what they're really doing is they're projecting their own addiction problem onto somebody else so that they don't have to own what's going on inside of them.
Yeah, that's why certain sins are popular, I think, for us to scapegoat, because they tend to be ones that maybe not all of us deal with.
Right.
And so the more common thing, that means I have to admit that I'm dealing with something. I know a number of people who are in recovery from substance use that do take some of those addictive tendencies into something like exercise. Like they recognize their personality trait and they try to channel it into something positive. Can you talk about what you think needs to be included in that for it to be a healthy transfer?
Yeah, it's so funny you should mention that because that was the topic of discussion in my meeting this morning.
Okay.
The one guy was actually talking about, gee, I've been sober for 3 months, but now I can't stop going to the gym. I'm working out twice a day. I've become a vegan, So listen, human beings, there are certain temperaments and dispositions that are more likely to go all in on something, like I have a friend of mine who likes to say, if they ever come up with a pill to overcome alcoholism, I'll take 10 of them. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So there are just some people who are more like all in types, right? They don't have a dimmer. They just go all on or they're all off, right? And when you in early recovery in particular, you often develop cross addictions, right? So you give up alcohol and you take up porn, or you give up, taking Xanax and Klonopin, and you end up taking up having a spending or shopping addiction. You can't get off the internet, and you can't. I mean, I know people like that. Like people like that. They have who have 200 pairs of shoes in their closet, right? As if the next pair of shoes is going to take care of the internal problem they have right? And it's like, really, you think a pair of pumps is going to overcome that anxiety?
Mhm.
Do you actually think, or that loneliness, or that sadness, or that grief, or that trauma? And yet, that's what they're doing, and they'd start to do it compulsively, like to the point of debt, going into debt. So anyway, I think you have to monitor and regulate. I mean, when you have enough self-knowledge after a while, you can start to monitor and say, oh, I think I'm becoming a little attached to this other new behavior, and I need to, that is not emotional sobriety, and I have to deal with it.
Mhm.
Yeah. In your moment of reckoning, so to speak, where you really said, okay, I need to go back to the 12 steps. I'm just wondering, how do people remove enough layers where they see clearly? I mean, I'm even through my mind thinking, I need to go away for a half day and just sit with myself and ask God, reveal to me where my addiction is, because there's so much noise that we often don't see it clearly. So, what was that like for you, and how do you encourage people to discover that on their own?
Well, honestly, that was one of the purposes of the book, right? Like, was to help people
Mhm.
go on a journey of self-examination. Some people will buy the book who already know, I smoke too much weed. And by the way, I know
Mhm.
tons of Christians who smoke too much weed.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe that's just in
Mhm.
Nashville, but I doubt it.
No.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, I know a number of people who,
Mhm.
and, or any of these other kinds of behaviors that I've just mentioned, right? And, so the book could take you on a journey of self-examination to really take a look inwardly at what's going on, to
Mhm.
identify your unhealthy attachments to ways of making life more tolerable apart from God.
Mhm.
Mm. And your
Mhm.
workbook, I was looking at it
Yes.
this morning, really offers those practical
Yeah.
applications.
Yeah. I'm usually very suspicious of workbooks.
Mhm.
And the reason I am is because I've been around publishing long enough to know that oftentimes they'll create a workbook because it's a peripheral product that will probably make a little more money, right? But
Mhm.
they're not really well done. Lots of them are not well done. This one's well done. I've
Mhm.
actually put a lot of effort. It's 120 pages, and it's a really meaty workbook that I think will really help people go through each of the steps step by. I go into granular detail. This is how you do step 2. This is how you do step 3, and you
Mhm.
could do it alone, but preferably you'd get 4 or 5 friends together, and for just 3 months decide we're going to do the steps together.
Mhm.
Mhm. Oh, I love that. Yeah, gather people. And what role do you think community plays in that, in the 12 steps?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a mantra that I really believe. It's we get sick alone and we get well together.
Wow.
Addictions, self-defeating behaviors grow in the dark
Mhm.
like mildew.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
it's just the perfect natural soil in which addictions and attachments can get hold of us, right? When we come into community, like it's interesting, in the 12 steps, nowhere is the word I used.
Mhm.
Nowhere does it say, I admit I'm powerless over blank and that my life is. It's the first word of the 12 steps is we. We admitted that
Mhm.
we were powerless over alcohol, drugs, sex, porn, whatever your thing is,
Mm.
work, chasing success, having affairs, whatever your thing is, right? Looking for the perfect partner, which is a big addiction, right? Like kooky.
Mm.
Um, and so it's recovery is really best lived out and experienced in community because one of the great accelerants of addiction is shame. And the only
Mhm.
way that shame
Mm.
can be dealt with is by bringing it out into the open. It has to be spoken. And these communities, if a person chooses to go to one, are really great at just receiving people in and without shame or judgment, because we're all there for the same reason. It's not like anyone's in here going, wow, you did that. It's like, no, we did that. um And you can do that in the comfort of your living room with 5 friends who are just willing to be courageous for a couple of weeks while they do the steps with each other, you know? So community is really. There's a guy named Johan Hari, and he's a researcher, and he has a great quote. He says, "The opposite of addiction is not sobriety; it's connection."
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So that's a really important idea. I think it's more than connection, but I appreciate the sentiment in what he's saying. That connection is important because at the core of an addiction is a felt disconnection from God, ourselves, and others. So it's about restoring connection to God, self, and others. That's so important on the recovery journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My husband works in transitional housing, and almost everybody is in recovery. And part of their model is that they live in community.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why, because it is hard to do it alone. And when you are alone, those old patterns just start getting really familiar. But those, like you said, are some of the more public, non-acceptable addictions: drugs, alcohol, pornography, maybe. But I think for our audience to remember that those same principles apply to some of the more socially acceptable.
Yeah, can we actually just ask our friends or our brothers and sisters listening to this to stop making this stigmatizing, ridiculous, unbiblical, binary kind of assessment that there are unacceptable addictions, right?
Mhm.
Socially unacceptable. Like, what makes your workaholism acceptable?
Mhm.
Right? What makes your porn addiction acceptable, or your shopping? They're all unacceptable.
Right.
Right? And yes, some of them are more public and oftentimes can have, significant health problems associated with them. But you get the same process, the same neurological process that happens in the mind of a meth addict is precisely the same as what happens in the mind of somebody, in the brain of somebody who's buying too many shoes.
Mhm.
It's the exact same process. There's zero difference, but it's the only difference is the amount of dopamine that's getting released. Okay, but it's the exact same process.
Mhm. Yeah, or posting on Instagram and seeing how many likes you get. And
Oh,
every time you get a like, there's that hit.
yeah. You can't stop gaming. I mean, I know a lot of people in that category, mostly guys, younger guys who find themselves literally like, I know someone who's gone to treatment because of their addiction to gaming. Like, can't not sleeping. They just keep gaming, you know? And you know what? Like, sometimes you hear someone say, "Oh, Bill's got a drinking problem," or "Billy's got a porn problem," or "Joan's got a spending and debt problem," right? Or whatever, right? And I'm always saying to them, "Okay, I understand why you're saying that, but there's a better way to say it. The better way to say it is Billy has a drinking solution, and Janie has a spending solution. These are the drinking and the spending, or the gambling or your workaholism that's not the problem. It's the solution to the problem in your mind. And so what the steps do is help us realize that whenever we look to an external solution to solve an internal problem, it's like going to the hardware store to buy bread. Like, you're shopping in the wrong place, right? And then, but you keep doing it compulsively, thinking, okay, well, this time it's going to work, or this time it's going to work as well as it did the first time I did it, but it doesn't. Right now, I got to buy 2 pairs of shoes to get the same experience I had when I used to get just from 1 pair of shoes, right? And so what we have to understand, and this should bring up compassion for people. Like, we call them problems, but they're really misguided solutions, and they're just what humans do. It's like, we should have compassion for people. It's like, well, of course you did that. Right? You were in pain. And this is the kind of thing humans do when they're in pain. But we now need to arrest that problem and come up and face the real problem inside, whatever that is, that's driving this behavior. And the steps will do that for anybody.
A lot of our listeners have young adult children or older teens, and maybe they're panicking right now because they're thinking of their children and, oh my gosh, is this an addiction? Is the video gaming? Is the, whatever it is, the sports gambling, the whatever. And how do you talk to parents about who are in that stage of life about some of those fears that they have?
Yeah, so I have permission to talk about this. So my son is now 2.5 years sober, and we had a few rodeos in treatment with that one, and he unfortunately shares my genes, and so you know so I'm very empathic toward people who are either in that situation or people that are have anxiety that maybe they or are heading in that direction. So the first thing I would say is you need to have very honest, open, direct conversation with your kids about the addictive patterns that can set in um, without their knowing that it's happening. Uh,
Mm.
I was talking to someone the other day, and they were looking at their kid's screen time, and they had spent 9 hours on TikTok in one day.
Hmm.
Now, hello, that's a problem. And I will tell you that those companies, whether it's Meta or the company that owns TikTok, etc., they are intentionally, nefariously trying
Mhm.
to addict you. That is their business plan. Their business plan isn't just to attract you, it's to addict you to their product so that you can't stop watching it. Or right, same thing with sports betting or whatever. I talked to a parent the other day of a kid who's got now a 14-year-old who has lied their way onto a sports betting platform, and that's all they think about. They can't get off their phones. Brene Brown said something interesting. It's in the book. She says, we are the most addicted cohort in human history.
Wow.
Addictions right now should be at the forefront of every conversation because they are everywhere. And it is very hard to run the gauntlet of life without getting snagged in more than one, right? Because they're quick fixes. But that fix eventually becomes a bigger problem than the problem it was attempting to fix, right?
Right.
Like, and that's the nature of addiction. It's always self-escalating, right? And everybody's got them. There's just, I know there's going to be some listeners going, no, it's not me. Thank you. Oh, I'm going to pray for those nice people. It's like, okay, honey, I got news for you.
Mhm.
There are no those people. It's just us people. And sure, someone else may
Right.
have a more noticeable one or a more severe one than you do, but you are not exempt.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Because it's the human condition in some way
Yes.
that we are
Yes.
looking to fill that hole in our hearts
Yes.
with something that is not God.
Right.
And then we get a little bit of pleasure and our brain goes, oh, this must be it. So we keep going back, keep going back, keep going back.
Yeah.
And like you said, that escalating what worked last week. I mean, I know this is true for drug addiction. What worked last week, I need to double it to get the same high.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that it just, oh man. So
Yeah.
in some ways that feels overwhelming. Like, okay, what are we all dealing with? And in some ways it also feels comforting that this is the way we are wired. Some maybe have a bigger challenge, like you mentioned, your genes may have that tendency, or a personality may have that tendency to pull you stronger. But it is part of the human wiring to be looking outside of ourselves to
Yeah.
fix that internal problem.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend the other day who's one of these annoying people that, maybe once a month someone gives him a glass of wine and he drinks half and leaves the rest. I look at people like that and I'm like, really? Like, wouldn't that be nice, or somebody, who can like have can say no to donuts. You know what I mean? Like I just always look at them like, you really are annoying. But he came back to me. He read a copy of the manuscript and he's like, my addiction is perfectionism. And I can't stop. And I'm like, awesome. Now we're at step one. We admitted we were powerless over perfectionism and that it's made our lives unmanageable. Because he's like, I get a dopamine hit every time I can tell somebody, see, I told you so. Or I was right. And he says, and I get a dopamine hit, and it has negative consequences because frankly, people don't like to be around critical, judgmental people who have to have things done their way because their way is the only way to do it. That perfectionist mindset. And I'm like, yeah, okay, well, the 12 steps, we're really going to help you with this.
I love that humble posture so much. And even thinking through like how we talk to our young adults or, older teens about some of this, coming from a posture of, yeah, me too. And I need this every bit as much as you do. It's such a different attitude and it will be received differently. Like even the way that you said that to him, great. The 12 steps work for you too. It will work for that too. That is such a welcoming posture. And I like what you said about like addiction should be a main topic of conversation. That feels important. And that as the more we talk about it, the more we can share in that. So how do you on a regular basis talk about addiction in your family and with your friends?
Well, for obvious reasons, in my family, it's a very open conversation, right? My wife is in a 12-step program called Al-Anon, which is for partners or family members or friends or partners of people with addiction, because they end up as sick as the person who has the identified addiction by virtue of the relationship, right? Like the relationship becomes very codependent and kind of crazy. I, by the way, think everyone in the world should go to Al-Anon because I think at some level everyone's also codependent, but that's a separate conversation for another day. We have very open conversations. And now, obviously, with my son, right? That experience for our whole family was difficult, and we all had to have very open conversations about it, for which I'm really grateful now, right? Really grateful. I think that you really should sit with your kids and just have very frank conversations. Every parent should probably read the book Dopamine Nation. They also should read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation.
Yeah,
those two books are pretty great because to have parents understand what's going on, right? And like Dopamine Nation is a really good book because it really helps people to understand what is the addictive process in the brain. Now, I don't deal with that in my book, right? For me, like for the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W., I approach it from the spiritual side, right? As a therapist, I could have done it from the psychological side, but I'm much more interested in the spiritual side of what addictions are about. And the fact that Bill W. said that, yes, of course, there are psychological and neurological things in play here, but he believed that the solution was principally spiritual. And so that's why I wrote a book that was more about the spirituality of addiction and recovery for everybody. And it's a little bit more in my wheelhouse.
In a midlife, I mean, if I just read you a list of all the hard things that I've been around this week, midlife is hard.
Yeah.
What about midlife specifically makes us prone to addictive behaviors?
Yeah. I mean, midlife is complicated. And having now being at maybe the latter stage of midlife, I will tell you this, it gets better.
Well, that's good
news. That's good
Yes.
news.
Yeah,
Ian.
I mean, really, it does. I mean, so many of the things that bothered me in my 40s and 50s just don't bother me anymore. Like I've kind of just sort of moved past them and in a really healthy way. A lot of the questions and concerns of those decades are gone for me. And I have settled into a kind of beautiful peace with a lot of that stuff. And so hang in. That's message number one, like hang in. But I like to think of if you think about the journey of life, and as you know, there's this language around first half of life, second half of life, right? Think of it this way: like the first half of life is like the parable of the talents. You're spending a lot of time unearthing the things you're good at and trying to make dividends on them to prove your adequacy, to build an ego, right? You're building an ego, right? And then in the second half of life, I think it's more the prodigal son. You stop living in the parable of the talents, and you imperceptibly and gradually start to move toward an entirely different agenda for your life. And that agenda is about forgiveness. It's forgiveness for the people who hurt you, forgiveness for yourself for the ways that your life is smaller than you had hoped it was going to be. That, for the things that you did and the things that you failed to do in the first half. And, you're just going through and then also this kind of desperate, like, oh my gosh, 10 years ago, there were so many doors open and now only half of those doors are open. There's so many things to go through in midlife, so many things to grieve, right? Like, here's a sad fact. Dare I tell your people this? The older you get, the more life, in the first half of life is always giving you new things. There's a lot of firsts. My license, I got a license. I got married. I got my first job. I got my first raise. I got my first child. I got my first this. And the older you get, the fewer firsts there are. And not only that, but life starts to subtract things from you. Health, your looks, your quote unquote relevance in the culture. Like things just start getting taken away. Now you can navigate this beautifully or really poorly. And it does, and with grace and poise. You can do this with grace and poise. Or you can train wreck, right? Like you can get a divorce and go find somebody who's going to like revitalize your heart, or whatever kooky thing you want to come up with. Or you can take up drinking, or you can take up, getting addicted to sleeping pills, or you can, whatever the thing is. But those kinds of existential pain, the only thing that's going to really address that is a spiritual relationship with God. That is the only thing that is going to fill that void. And if whatever else you want to put in there is going to come back and bite you, it may work in that fix, whatever fix you've come up with for that pain. It may work in the short term, but in the long term, I promise you, it is going to rob you of the life God has for you. Period. I have no doubt about that. I've never seen it work any other way. I've never had someone come back to me and say, gosh, thank goodness I'm an alcoholic. I don't know how I would have coped with all this pain if I didn't have booze. I've never heard anybody say that. Right? So, and that could be said about any of these lesser, more subtle addictions that we're talking about that are equally soul destructing.
That feels really important what you said too about just that acknowledgement that in the second half of life, there's things subtracted from you. There's a lot subtracted. I mean, just even running through my list this week, like a loss of a parent, your health from cancer. And I'm considering, even in my own heart right now, just what is the invitation in that? Yes, it's being taken away from us, but if we are able to look it in the face and acknowledge the pain, what is the invitation there with God in it?
It's a really great question to ask.
Yeah, it makes me think of women I've known in church that are older, like say in their 70s, maybe 80s, who have carried themselves in a way that I think that's the kind of woman I want to be at that age, that really is not concerned with self, that she has entered this phase of life where she has come to peace with those external things being subtracted and saying, with such genuine intention, I am so grateful that I'm here today to serve you.
Yeah.
And they are women who keep showing up to care for people in their lives. And I think there's something in that about the acknowledgement.
Well, what you're describing is something I didn't mention, right? If in the first half of life, and this is inescapable, so people shouldn't feel bad about it. if the first half of your life is about the construction of an ego, the second half is about its deconstruction. And it's about letting go. It's just about letting go. And by the way, is there a better 2-word summary of the gospel than just that? Letting go.
Wow.
Right? And so, there is a way to navigate these inescapable losses, and maybe part of it is just not even framing them as losses. This is the natural order of life. You came in here with nothing. It makes sense that slowly over time, as you move toward the end of your life, you're going to leave here with nothing. So it's just the natural order of things, and you can fight it, but it will cause you more pain. Right? You can fight it all you want. You can Botox your way out of this if you want, but eventually it is going to cause you more, and no harm. I don't have any. That was kind of mean. I don't mean that because if that's your thing, that's fine.
No,
although,
we
by
get
the way,
it.
I have met people addicted to it.
Yes. No, it's a relevant example.
Right. So it's just like, in my mind, it's like, nope, it's just not going to change the natural order of things. So yes, accepting, letting go, accepting life on life's terms. I'm getting older. This is what happens. I do the best I can, but I'm just going to be a person that does this gracefully and actually embraces it. Just doesn't fight with it.
Gosh, let go. There we go. The two-word description. Ian, as we're closing today, what would be your final encouragement as people maybe are considering stepping into the 12 steps and getting your workbook and going through it?
Well, I mean, look, you see these depictions on television of 12-step meetings. Like, did you watch The Bear? Or did you watch, I'm trying to think of other shows. There's a show on TV on Netflix now called Louder Milk, and it's about a guy in 12 steps. And there are these glum, sad people sitting around on metal chairs, just a mess. And I'm like, that is nothing like any meeting I've ever been to. Like, every 12-step meeting I have ever been to has been punctuated with lots of laughter and joy. There's hilarity, there's camaraderie, there's fellowship, there's, yeah, sure, we have tearful moments. They're, of course, to be expected. But most of them, there's a lot of like joy in those rooms, right? Because we have found a common solution. And so just to tell them, this is a very serious and it's hard work, but really at the end of the day, it's about the recapturing of joy that you experience when you're free, right? When you're disentangled from the many attachments that are holding your life down. And so just prepare yourself for that. The other thing is if you have someone in your life, let's just say you still don't buy into the whole thing. Okay, that's fine. But maybe you have a son or a partner or a parent that's in the program and you've never really understood what it's about. You should read this book. Like, this book would you'd go, oh, that's what they're doing. Like, I just think every person of faith should know everyone should know what's going on in the basement of their churches 5 times a week, right? Where all those meetings take place. And they should come to realize that all the miracles, literally the signs and wonders that are happening in the basement is amazing, that they don't know anything about. And if they did, they would then maybe take the bold step of wanting to bring it upstairs into the sanctuary so that everybody could know those kinds of miracles.
Wow. That is good. Bring it upstairs. Bring it up.
Bring it upstairs, kids.
Okay, and how do we find out more about how maybe our Enneagram is connecting with some of our addictive tendencies?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, the Enneagram, look at the passion associated or the deadly sin associated with every type, and there's an addiction. So, Krista, what's your type?
Social 2.
Okay, so you probably are somebody that has an addiction to helping other people. And sometimes it's compulsive. And it gives you a mood-altering effect. And it has negative consequences because you get resentful and angry when people don't reciprocate, when people don't take care of you, when you're burnt out because, you've done, right? And yet 20 minutes later, you're doing it again. And then, Alex, what's your type?
6.
All right. So the sort of the addictive pattern of, and sixes, by the way, because anxiety is such a feature for sixes, right? Like they're a little primed for addictions, right? Because there's a lot of ways to assuage anxiety, and so but certainly the sort of addictive relationship you have sometimes to um, authority figures that are
Hmm.
giving you answers, the addictive pattern that you can get into with just your own anxiety, and to fear, ruling your life, um, and constantly projecting what's going to go wrong. And at any moment, I mean, these are just addictive loops.
Right.
Like
The
for a
ruminating.
six, like for a six, the 12 steps would be great for a six, and for a two,
Mm-hmm.
like for you to say, I am powerless over my anxiety and it's making my life unmanageable. But step two, I'm coming to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to health, sanity,
Mm-hmm.
and making a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God, right? Like, and being able to work a program where like you're doing that all the time in your head. It's not a one and done deal, right? You're able to be tapping into the wisdom of the steps all day long, so that when a fear comes up or you're catastrophizing about something, it's like, all right, God, I'm turning. You've got all kinds of, like, you're projecting something terrible about your kids that is going to happen, right? And you just go, God, like, I'm powerless over my anxiety, and it's making my life emotionally unmanageable right now. I believe you can restore me to sanity. So I just have to turn myself and my child over to your care and get on with it, and live. And again, the steps sound simple. They're not simple. They are simple, but they're not easy. Which is sometimes why it takes a village to do it. So yeah, some people think that there's an addictive personality type, and I want everyone to know there's no such thing as an addictive personality type. Like, people go, oh, he's got an addictive personality. No, that's actually, you might be with somebody who has poor impulse control, but there is no personality that I know. I see all 9 Enneagram types represented in every domain of recovery, whether it's overeaters or alcoholics or drug addicts. Like, I see plenty of sixes, I see lots of twos, I see nines, whatever. Everybody is susceptible equally.
That is
Equal
so good.
opportunity.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, and that what drives us to addiction might be different, but it's the
Yep.
same.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's
Yep.
great.
Mm-hmm.
Ian, thank you so much. What a gift. What a true gift. And I feel like there were so many new insights today that I personally am taking with me, and I know many others are. So really appreciate you.
Well, thanks for having me on.